Thanks for understanding.
Yeah, it's wonderful to welcome Professor Gary Saul Morson of Northwestern University once again to this program. I believe he's been on the show twice, so this is his third time. I've enjoyed his writings on Russian literature, especially his book Wonder Confronts Certainty, which I actually have right here. So in today's show, we're discussing his recent article in First Things. Is titled Dostoyevsky's Credo. Gary, welcome to the show once again. How are you?
Oh, thanks again for having me. I really enjoy being here. And thanks for the plug of my book.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I'll say it's a good introduction to, I guess, the Russian mind in, I guess, late 19th, early 20th century. Okay, so let's talk about Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of Russia's greatest men of letters. What do you know of his religious faith?
Well, that's really an interesting question. I mean, he was raised to be religious, and then, when he grew up and as a young man, went to the capital, to St. Petersburg, he was exposed to, the irreligious attitudes of the day. So he never lost his faith, but it kind of weakened. And then came the great shock of his life when, he was arrested for participating in a sort of radical discussion group and was kept in prison for 8 months, interrogated, and then one day told he was going to be let out to the Senate Square and executed. And he describes this, many times, both in his, in his fiction and in his life. He and a group of other people were let out. They could see gallows, but they weren't going to be hanged. They were going to be shot. They could see what looked like coffins to take away their bodies. They were, given sort of white shrouds, the sort of thing that people are buried in to wear. And a priest came and urged them to confess and gave them last rites. Finally, they're going to be shot in groups. The first group was let out, to shot with the firing squad facing them. They were allowed to sort of cover their eyes. And at the very last moment, an imperial courier comes galloping up to say that in his infinite mercy, the Tsar has reduced their sentence from execution to a time in a Siberian prison camp and time in the army after that as a private. And Dostoevsky, you can see he never forgot this. Of the people there, I mean, one of them, his hair turned white, man in his 20s, on the spot. Another one went mad and never recovered his sanity. And the third went on to write Crime and Punishment, and novels like that. And on his way to being marched out to Siberia, a group of ladies, particularly one named Madame Podwyzina, met him. She was the wife of a former convict. She comforted him and gave him a copy of the only book prisoners were allowed to have, which was the New Testament. He went off to Siberia. Years later, he heard that she was deeply depressed, and he wrote her what was the most famous letter in Russian literature. That's what my article about this letter. And it's a letter about how, although, I'll just summarize very briefly now, despite all the doubts that he has based on, science and the materialist worldview, which was as strong then as it is now, right? I mean, no new discoveries really changed the picture. In spite of all those doubts, he clings to his faith, right? And he describes it in such a way that, I guess we'll get into this, the doubt becomes a part of his faith. And for the rest of his life, he writes great Christian novels, but not sort of pious Sunday school type things, but about people who deeply struggle with all the arguments against faith in God, both moral and rational. So that even, he was proud of the fact that the strongest arguments against religious belief were in his Christian novels. Because, if you're really intellectually honest, you don't refute the weakest idea of your opponent. You refute the strongest ones. And if they haven't made the strongest ones, you make them for them. And that's which is what he did. And so his novels are about a struggle to have faith. They're not a calm faith. right? He experienced faith as a kind of struggle. Anyway, that's the short answer.
That's it. Yeah. Before we get more into that, I'd like to read a little bit from one of Confronting your marvelous book. So to quote, as a compulsive gambler as well as a former revolutionary, Dostoyevsky appreciated their psychological connection. In two works he was writing simultaneously, Crime and Punishment and The Gambler, he explored the intoxicating appeal of risk and the thrill of danger. So tell me more about this.
Yeah, well, Dostoevsky was a compulsive gambler, right? And in his novella, The Gambler, it deals with a compulsive gambler, but who doesn't gamble because he's interested in winning. He gambles for the intoxication, the thrill of being in a strange town and betting your last dollar, on a spin of the wheel with everything at stake, and the intensity that produces. And then when you win, the sudden change of fortune from extreme poverty to everybody fawning on you in extreme wealth, right? And which is itself the pleasure, not the wealth. So that then the gambler will just squander the wealth and start all over again, because it's not the wealth itself that matters, right? It's the thrill of the risk and the change in status. Well, that's exactly the case with revolutionaries, right? They had a thrill of the sheer intoxication of being a terrorist, of being a revolutionary, of risking everything, all at the same time. Some of the people at the time described this as revolutionism, that is, the thrill of revolution for its own sake. Or, you start with, you want a utopian society, so you have revolution as the means. But then revolution becomes the goal in itself, and terrorism becomes the means, and then terrorism becomes the goal. Ceases to be the goal, and the means becomes the goal too. It's the sheer intoxication of that kind of life, right? Where, yes, it'll be short, but it'll be thrilling, right? And that's the risk part, right? And then, of course, the idea that you can completely change everything overnight is what a revolution promises to do, right? So in that sense, it's like winning at gambling too. And the interesting thing about that book, though, is how it was written. Dostoevsky was incredibly in debt and impoverished at the time, and he was so desperate for money that he signed a contract to deliver a novel to a certain publisher named Stilovsky at a certain time. And Stilovsky wasn't interested in the novel. He was interested in the forfeiture rights provisions if Dostoevsky didn't do it, which was he would own the rights to all of Dostoevsky's books already written and to be written. So he didn't want Dostoevsky to turn the novel in, right? Well, it was a month beforehand, and he had been working on Crime and Punishment, but he wasn't going very well, and he didn't know what to do. He confided the problem to one of his friends, and his friend said, well, let's all get together and write it with you. We'll do it, each do a chapter. No, that wouldn't be honest, that's Dostoevsky. All right, says the guy, there's something else we can do. There's this new science called stenography. It had just been invented at the time, right? And the Russian stenography school is graduating its first class. Why don't you hire a stenographer and just dictate a novel off the top of your head? So we decided to do that, right? And, we have her memoir. She shows up, and to make a long story short, they become interested in each other while he's dictating, right, this novel. And you could almost read the novel, which is The Gambler, okay? Passages sort of are like letters to her, right? And, well, he finishes the novel that way, like a day or two early, and he wants to go deliver it. But Stilovsky has left town, so he can't be delivered. He doesn't know what to do. Well, she's the practical one. She says, well, register with the police that you're delivering it, so you'll have proof, which he does, right? Well, what happens after that is, a few days later, he shows up at her house. She's living with her parents and says, that was so successful. I'd like to hire you to do my next novel that way. Okay, well, what's it about? Well, this novel is about an older man who falls in love with a younger woman who has worked for him, and he tells the story exactly of their relation. Right? And then, the only thing I can't decide is when he proposes to her, what does she say? And that's how he proposes to her, right? And she replied, well, I really wanted a day to think it over, but I know he'd be so offended that I just said yes, right? The way she said was, Well, if she loves him, why wouldn't she say yeah? And that's how he, winds up getting. But the Gambler was not only about risk; it was itself a great product of a great risk. That with Dostoyevsky at the same time. So he really understood, risk and its psychological attractions and dangers.
So, how did Dostoevsky, I guess, renounce the ways of revolution when other intellects of his caliber didn't?
That's another great question. I mean, it was probably the his experiences in the Siberian prison that did it. It changed his view of human nature and the world. Instead of having this naive view of that many intellectuals have about the oppressed Russian people and how revolution was going to do wonderful things for them. They understood the science of human behavior. He saw human nature so complex that their supposed science of human behavior seemed laughable. It was incredibly naive. And then he saw that the Russian people weren't anything like the sort of cardboard caricature of people whom the revolutionaries imagined. They could be the French mobs, they could be anyone, right? Just people without knowing anything. And then he realized that what really, really motivates people is not what the revolutionaries think. There were all these strange things that happened. Like he would find prisoners who would suddenly, for no reason, attack a guard, knowing that they would be beaten mercilessly for it, right? If they lived at all. But they did it because what makes you human, he decided, you can't feel yourself to be human unless you have some agency, that you have human freedom. And a prisoner will suddenly lash out just to show that he can do what he wants, no matter what the cost. Well, that presumably would be the case. Suppose you could build the perfect social utopia where, imagine you were put in a hotel, he said, right, where you were told for the rest of your life everything would be given to you. You wouldn't have to work at all, right? It would all be right there. Just express a wish. Well, you'd be happy for a few weeks, but then suddenly you realize that life was utterly pointless because you had no choices to make, because there was no you. The most important thing about yourself, your humanness, which consists in freedom for the sake of material goods. And you'd probably kill yourself as a result when you suddenly realize that. That is, it's what the socialists think. The socialists are like, he liked to say, imagine people as in a giant anthill, where everyone does their own role. But ants don't want to be free, whereas freedom and choice are the essence of being human. So the whole, social or materialist mentality is built on a view of human nature, which is false. That's what he finds out. In Siberia. So he can't go back to these people who seemed incredibly naive to him. And he looks for something else, which is a recovery of his own faith in a strange way.
Yes. I guess that's the central difference between the Eastern European and the Western European mindset. I was reading about the great Hungarian Cardinal Mindszenty and how by holding on to his faith, he found freedom, from communist tyranny and whatnot. Whereas in the Western European mind, freedom is entirely, I think, disconnected from religious faith. So, So how would Dostoevsky connect religious faith to?
Well, unless life can only be meaningful if you can do one thing rather than another. If you are simply an automaton pre-programmed, there's no meaning in the world, right? And that's what determinists and materialists think we are. All the laws of nature dictate what we do. That's it. But religion offers you a sense of meaning. But meaning can only exist if there is human choice, if there's freedom. When you can do one thing or another. Otherwise, there's no good and evil if you're just pre-programmed, right? So religion gives you good and evil and gives you meaning. But to do so, it has to give you freedom. That's where he sees it, right? And so that's why, for him, any form of utopianism and religion have to be contrary to each other. Because one takes away freedom and the other depends on freedom.
Yes. And I believe there's a quotation that you featured by Tolstoy, of course, Dostoevsky's contemporary, in the first next article, where he said, if human life can be rationally explained, then that'll be the end of life. So I wonder whether Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or both of them think that perhaps their medium of writing literature is a better window into human nature than the tools of social science.
Yeah, and if you think about it, there's a clear and obvious proof that the great novelists understood human nature and human psychology better than any social scientist or psychologist who ever lived. It's a very easy proof. And it goes something like this. If a psychologist had understood human nature as well as Dostoyevsky or George Eliot or Jane Austen, much less Tolstoy, they would have been able to create a portrait of a human being as believable as, let's say, the heroines of George Eliot or the heroes of Dostoyevsky. As three-dimensional, as believable, as compelling, rather than stick figures. But none of them has come remotely close. So the novelist must have understood things that the professional psychologists didn't. And all professional psychologists are doing really is sort of transcribing little insights from the novelist and presenting them as science.
I see. Yeah, and in Wonder Confronts Certainty, you've outlined that the Russian novel is a different beast than the novels as it was written, say, in England or France during the same period. So, for the great novelists of Russia, from the 19th to the 20th century, what was the novel for?
Yeah, the Russians. Well, even to this day, Russians think of literature as not just a reflection of life, but the most important thing in the world. That it's not. We might think that literature exists to reflect life, but a Russian is more likely to think. Certainly, Dostoevsky thought, Tolstoy thought that maybe it's almost the reverse, that life exists to be made into great literature. Right? That is, it's the revelation of the ultimate truths of human existence. Right? Western European novelists certainly showed a lot of important things about human psychology and human existence, but they didn't phrase it as, and now we're going to use this to address the ultimate questions of, God and meaning and freedom and faith and good and evil. They kind of left that mostly implicit. They would have been, that's childish to do that. We don't do things like that. But the Russians did, right? They used, this is what life is about. This is the most important thing. So we have to do it here. And that became the traditional Russian novel right up to the present day. And when great Russian writers first became translated, into French and English, they took, both countries and Germany by storm. Like, they had never seen anything like this before. And it's just a wonderful essay, by Virginia Woolf called The Russian Point of View about how nothing that we Englishmen or Frenchmen have produced can hold a candle to Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. Right? Everything that we do, when you compare it with them, looks like a trivial exercise. Right? But, Tolstoy knows the world and the human mind the way nobody else ever had. And Dostoevsky can grab you by the throat to make you face questions that's too easy to ignore. That's how she wrote, and she wasn't the only one. A lot of writers, did that. But that's my favorite, statement of it by a great novelist herself, right, Virginia Woolf, right, who learned a lot from Tolstoy. Herself.
Yes. So back to Dostoevsky. Would you say that would you say any of his characters are immoral, or that their moral codes are based on the wrong premises?
Oh yeah, he has a great political novel all about terrorists. They certainly have the wrong premises. And then, in Crime and Punishment, the hero, reasons his way to murder through fashionable ideology. Some of them come to see the error of their ways and why, right? And some of them don't. But you get the mindset of both, right? And Dostoevsky didn't think that, his opponents, the revolutionaries or the atheists, were shallow. He always described, some of them were, of course, but he preferred to describe the ones who, while wrong, had deep reasons for what they were doing. And he knew that was possible because he had been a revolutionary with good motives and deep reasons. Right? He didn't think they were all just, sadists. Right? They had been led astray by a false way of thinking. But that's very different from being, shallow or ill-intentioned. And he has one sentence in one of his essays where he said that good people can be led to do obviously horrendous things without ceasing to think of themselves and maybe even being good people. That's what's really horrible.
I'm reminded of that passage in, of course, Crime and Punishment. This was before the murder, where Raskolnikov was on the street and he saw this horse-drawn carriage, and the driver of the carriage stops and beat his horse senselessly. And he saw that scene and he was like sick for days afterwards, because of course he couldn't reason why someone would do such a thing. And I wonder, had he found a justification, like that it was a justification for why the man did what he did, would he have followed through with the justification of his crime, without, say, seeking repentance or punishment at the end?
Well, but the hero Raskolnikov sees this in a dream, right? He dreams he's a little boy who witnesses it, and this horrendous, cruelty and beating this poor helpless horse, right? Just for the sheer pleasure of doing so. Okay, that is, and this is one of the things that really shocked Dostoyevsky when he was in Siberia. We still have the theory that well, people commit crimes because of social inequality or social oppression, and all you have to do to eliminate crime is just eliminate the social causes of it. That's incredibly naive. Sure, social inequality may contribute to it, but human nature would commit it in any case. This peasant beating the horse is doing it for the sheer pleasure of doing it. And he met, murderers in Siberia who had tortured children to death for the sheer pleasure of domination. And that is essential to human nature, and no social change is going to eliminate that, right? So, that's what he's seeing, what Raskolnikov was seeing in that dream, right? And, he's just a little boy, and he's in the dream, and he turns to his father and says, why are they doing that? And his father says, just don't look, let's move on. And that, of course, is one of the answers that people give to evil. It's not our affair, don't look, right? It's not healthy to look at. But Raskolnikov can't accept that answer. I mean, he can't just ignore it. It's too much a part of him. His consciousness of, human suffering, right? His deep compassion, right?
How much was Dostoevsky in his writings influenced by Kierkegaard?
Oh, not at all. Kierkegaard wasn't known at all at the time. So, but people draw the parallels frequently because here are these two thinkers coming up with some, similar idea, but Kierkegaard was sort of not known until much later. So he didn't know. But of course, later on, people discovered the two of them and put them together. And they're both, of course, rethinking Christianity, right? I mean, Kierkegaard within a Protestant tradition, Dostoyevsky within an Orthodox tradition, but they're thinking about a lot of similar questions.
And I wonder, was Dostoevsky aware of Friedrich Nietzsche at all? Because I found that there are plenty of similarities in their thinking. But of course, they came to radically different conclusions.
Yeah, Dostoevsky wasn't aware of Nietzsche, but Nietzsche had read Dostoevsky. Mm-hmm. Okay, a few short works of Dostoevsky, not even his best, had been translated into German, and Nietzsche stumbled upon them and read them and was impressed with the psychology. And he famously said, Dostoevsky is the only writer who has taught me anything about human psychology. Right? This is the only one who gets it. Right? If only he had read more Dostoevsky, he would have seen more of his own ideas there. But the difference is that those ideas, about the death of God, transcending morality, being a Superman, those are the ideas of Dostoevsky's heroes. But they're there to be refuted in Dostoevsky, whereas Nietzsche adopts them himself. But still, there's a lot of parallel between Dostoevsky's heroes and Nietzsche. Right?
So, what can Dostoevsky still teach us in regards to psychology, the human mind?
Oh, well, all the kinds of complexity about, the human mind, our attraction to evil, the way in which I mentioned freedom plays a big role, that the most fundamental thing about being human is the capacity to surprise, that that a human being is not an object and therefore you must regard the person capable of surprise. He was fascinated by the way in which guilt and shame motivate our reactions to the world in irrational ways, to the point where nobody understood humiliation more than he did. If you understand humiliation, you read his novels. But he even understood why people humiliate themselves. If the most painful thing is humiliate, why do that? But he understands that too. So I can say, if you're interested in irrationality, evil, cruelty, sadism, domination, nobody understood these better than Dostoyevsky. This is what, this is the place to go if you want to understand these things. Tolstoy was interested in different questions, but, if you really want to understand evil and all the evil things about it, this is the writer who is most affected by them and understands them most deeply.
Yes. He seemed to have a very, I suppose, pessimistic view of reason, with a capital R. The Enlightenment, over there in Western Europe, think that reason would lead humanity to emancipation and so forth. But Dostoevsky believed that he used to justify the most unreasonable thing possible.
Yeah, well, it can do both, right? But remember that, the bloodiest, cruelest philosophy in the history of the world, which is Bolshevism, right, or its heirs, thought it was purely rational and based itself on what it thought was what they thought was a hard science of society, right? As Marxism, Leninism claimed to be. They didn't cultivate the irrational. They thought they were the supreme rationalists. And, Dostoevsky understood that precisely because of the evil of human nature, it will co-opt reason to irrational ends. Reason can tell you how to do things, but it can't give you the impulse to use it for the right purposes. That is not going to come from reason. Reason doesn't have moral qualities built into it, right? You have to bring it to... Think about mathematics, right? Or the laws of physics. There's no place for good and evil in the law of gravity or the binomial theorem, right? If you think you can get them out of that, then you're going to fall prey to the worst things in the world. You have to get those elsewhere and then use what reason teaches you to forward them. Right?
Yeah, it can be quite staggering to know that the Soviet Union had some of the best mathematicians and chemists and physicists, but
more the mathematicians, because they suppressed chemistry and in various times suppressed physics because they thought their conclusions were politically wrong. They didn't believe in, for a while you couldn't do genetics because genetics seemed to suggest that human nature was not infinitely malleable. The periods when you couldn't do physics because the uncertainty principle seemed like contradicted the idea of reason can know everything. And various, now these were, some periods they got over this, but mathematics was where the best minds went because it was the only discipline that was never felt, either under Tsars or Soviets, to have any political implications. And so they developed this amazing, Russian tradition of great mathematicians, right? And I know, my own university, when the Soviet Union fell and we wanted to build a math department, we hired Russians. To the point where I remember at one point there was more Russian spoken in the math department than the Russian department. Because who was there? They were the Russians, right?
But of course, the literary boom that occurred in the 19th century busted when the Soviet Union came. Of course, you have Pasternak or Solzhenitsyn, but other than that, it just fell away.
Well, after there was a period of relative freedom in the 1920s. The tradition did continue, but by the time Stalin took over, the tradition continues underground. Okay, official writers are really all pretty awful, right? But you still got things that couldn't be published, only got published later. Were written, they said for the drawer, or occasionally smuggled abroad, and that's where the great masterpieces took place. And one thing that really I just noticed, a few years ago, was that if you think of the four great novels that came out, the four great writers of the prose works of the Soviet period, three, in an officially atheist society where atheism was the first principle, three of these four were Christian. And the fourth, though by a Jew, believed in ultimate values also, right? Solzhenitsyn was a Christian. Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote The Master and Margarita, was a Christian. Of course, Dr. Zhivago, you mentioned, right? Ends with a whole series of, Zhivago's a poet, and the epilogue to the book is a whole series of very Christian poems, explicitly so. And The fourth thing is, Vasily Grossman's book, Life and Fate, which deals with the same questions, and comes to very similar conclusions, just not expressed in, Christian terms. But they might as well be, And so it's the ones who they don't approve of who become their great writers, right?
To what extent did Christianity help contribute to the fall of the Soviet regime? Another question would be, to what extent can it help rebuild Russia after the Soviet Union failed?
Well, those are two different questions. I mean, the problem is that the Orthodox Church was basically taken over by the government. And now, the values it preaches are very unchristian values preached in the name of Christianity. So real Christianity has to be unofficial. Or by people who go to the church but don't, are not controlled by the hierarchy. Right? But Putin made sure that, the patriarch of the church would support his war in Ukraine, for instance, supports all the bloody things that can be done. Well, a lot of Christians broke away from that, right? From that, So you have to distinguish between Christianity and official Christianity, right? I think that in the Soviet period, Christian values, even if not explicitly called Christian values, but let's say just the humane values of great literature, played an enormous role in bringing down the Soviet Union. Because the great classics taught a morality completely at odds with Soviet morality. For example, in Soviet morality, compassion is a bad thing. But if you read Dostoyevsky or Dickens, they're the best things, right? So the classics were constantly undermining what the official morality was teaching. And when I read accounts of, people growing up, in, privileged families who nobody bothered to read the official Soviet classic, but they were all reading, the French and English, and 19th century classic, and it shaped their minds, their fundamental values, to the point where the official values, now we pay lip service to this, but we don't really believe it. So in that indirect way, I think it, not explicitly as Christianity directly, but as those values were incorporated in literature, played a big role.
I've always wondered, if I were to sit, across the table from Putin in the same privileged position that, Tucker was in, I'd be curious, what works of Russian literature would he have referenced, even if it's for self-serving purpose? Would he have mentioned Dostoyevsky or Tolstoy or any Soviet great?
Well, he would have mentioned some classic works, I would guess, interpreted in his own way. Like, he might have mentioned War and Peace, but he would have interpreted it as a work of great Russian nationalism, and that's all, right? I don't think he would have mentioned Dostoevsky. Or if he did, it says, oh yes, he's a Russian Orthodox writer. We like Russian Orthodoxy here. See what a nice patriarch. He couldn't have done that, but, I know it's going to sound strange, but Stalin was a lot crueler than Putin, right? There's no gulags now with millions of people. But Stalin was also much more literate than Putin. People think of him as just an illiterate thug, but he was a literate thug. He had a library of 20,000 volumes, which he collected himself, some of them as markings, and he developed his own cataloging system and had a librarian to take care of it for him, And, he read. He didn't just allow literature to be censored. He read it, himself. He read the novels that were being submitted to censorship if he wanted to, right? And commented on them. In a way that no American reader would. Because, he knew from, the 19th century experience, early 20th century, that literature was enormously important to Russians and maybe to everybody, right? So I don't think Putin does. I've never heard of Putin talking about great literature.
Does Russian literature and the works of Dostoevsky, do they still hold a place in Russian society today?
Oh yeah, definitely. Russian literature always will, and Dostoevsky, definitely does. He didn't during the Soviet period because he was too religious, but he's definitely come back. Into the Russian psyche and way of looking at things. And there are some. I'm thinking of one right now. very good Christian, writer, not Dostoyevsky, though, but good Christian writer in Russia today, named Vodolazkin. And he'd written a few novels. One is really good. It's about set in the Middle Ages. He was a scholar of the Middle Ages by training, the author, and it's called Laurus, which is the name of a saint. And it's about a young man who grows up, his adventures in life in the Middle Ages, his interactions with fate, and the world around him. And he's eventually going to end up as Father Laurus, at the end of the book. It's really a quite lovely book. I mean, it's really quite profound. He wrote some other novels, which are okay, but this is I think the only one that will really last. But he's certainly very much influenced by Dostoevsky and that whole tradition.
Yes. Tell me about the name of the writer and the title of the book again.
The writer is Vodolazkin, Vodolazkin, and the book is Laurus, Laurus.
Okay.
And he's written some articles, they've been translated in this magazine Plow. I don't know if you know it, it's a religious magazine. He's translated some of his articles. And, you can tell a lot of his views about time and life and morality from his novels, because they're Russian novels, so they speak explicitly about, moral and philosophical questions. Right? But Laurus is the best of them. It's really moving.
Okay. I shall look it up. So,
yeah, let me know if you enjoy it.
Okay. So finally, of course, in the Brothers Karamazov, there's this parable of Jesus and the Grand Inquisitor. So given, the political capture of the Orthodox Church in Russia these days, does the parable still remain relevant?
Well, you could almost say that, the Orthodox Church has been captured by the Grand Inquisitor, right? Novel, it accuses basically the Catholic Church of having been captured, or at least but, that's always a danger, right? The way it's phrased is that official Christianity, or official anything, will accept the three temptations Jesus refused, right? Material power, certainty, and the kingdom of this world, right? That's how Dostoevsky interprets those three. They're very seductive, but for Dostoevsky, it's the spiritual, and the spiritual only live in faith, and faith requires uncertainty. I don't have faith, in the Pythagorean theorem. I know it. Okay? Faith doesn't exist with that kind of knowledge, right? So it dwells in the realm of uncertainty, and so does moral choice, because if you were certain of all your moral choices, well, you just follow a formula, right? But it's the fact that we live in a world of uncertainty, that we don't necessarily know what the right choice is, that we might regret our choices. That's the moral world, in which, for Dostoevsky, the image of Christ was what we cling to, but not a formula. So, that's how he sees that story, right? But it's very tempting to see it in the human nature the other way, right?
Yes. Well, I think that's where we can close our conversation. Thank you very much, Gary Saul Morson, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. This is always fun. Thank you.